This is Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh, and today we're going to learn to play Axis and Allies Battle of the Bulge. Axis and Allies Battle of the Bulge was released in 2006 by Avalon Hill and designed by Larry Harris Jr. While this game has the title Axis and Allies, and it has the plastic miniatures of the other Axis and Allies titles, this is a completely different game. You'll see right away that the game board has hexes. There's a great deal of focus around supply lines. Combat is conducted with combat strips. And you do not buy units, you receive regular reinforcements per turn. Battle of the Bulge is the second game in Axis and Allies' campaign series. The first game in the series was D-Day. Then came Battle of the Bulge, and following that was Guadalcanal. Each of these games focus on the single campaign for these respective titles. And each game has different mechanics than the traditional Axis and Allies series. While D-Day is fairly easy to come by, Battle of the Bulge and Guadalcanal are extremely rare. These last two games sell for ridiculous prices on eBay, from anywhere from $100, $150, all the way up to $300 a piece. I get a lot of requests to do videos for these games, mainly because I think people just want to see what all the fuss is about. So, without further ado, let's take a look at Battle of the Bulge and we'll see how this game works. To help us get acquainted with the game, let's first look at the game board. The art design of this map is in a muted grayscale, so it can be difficult to see all the landmarks. So for each of our examples here, I will highlight the various landmarks and we'll go over their rules. First, I'm going to highlight these irregular shapes in green. These shapes represent the various cities and towns throughout the Ardennes area. Each of these towns and villages have a strategic value that's represented at the top of the hex by a number. These borders in red represent the current front line of the Axis forces. As the Axis player extends the front lines and captures these towns and villages, they increase their victory points to winning the game. Next, we're going to look at the network of roads that I've highlighted in yellow. Roads are critical to your supply lines. Your trucks that are carrying the valuable supplies for your troops can only move along roads. Another feature of the landscape to be aware of are rivers. Roads provide bridges across these rivers. However, if you take your units off-road, there are some hex edges that cannot be crossed by any units except for infantry. I've highlighted these shaded areas on the board in light blue. The necessary starting units are printed on the board itself and can quickly be set up for gameplay. The game is composed of 8 rounds of play. During the first 4 rounds, inclement weather has grounded all aircraft. During the last 4 rounds of the game, the weather is cleared and air support is available. As I said earlier, unlike previous Axis and Allies titles, you do not purchase units, you receive regular reinforcements. The Allies get regular reinforcements from the north, the west, and the south. The Axis receive their reinforcements solely from the east. The Allies can field their reinforcements through the green shaded hexes along the edge of the board. The Axis player can only field his reinforcements through the black shaded hexes at the eastern edge of the board. Neither side can field units through the red shaded hexes. As the Axis pushes forward the bulge of the front line, 2 things happen. The supply line for the German forces becomes much longer. and the Allies' abilities to place field units in the north and the south get squeezed. This push and pull of the front line, as well as the management of supply lines, is what makes Axis and Allies' Battle of the Bulge such an interesting game. Now that you've seen a rough overview of the game, we're going to slow down and I'll show you how to set up the game and how it works. So, get your bits together, people. It's time to set up the game. For the first step, you're going to place the game board. Next, we're going to place the combat strips by sliding them underneath the board. You want to push in the combat strips until just the finger hole is showing. You use the finger holes to pull out the combat strips to the number of units that are defending from attack. Place the combat strips in this order. First is infantry. Next is armor. Third is artillery. Next is trucks. After that is supplies. And finally, aircraft. Next, we're going to place the German cross victory point marker on number 0. And place the round marker on round 1. Next, we're going to place the front line markers. The starting units are printed on the board, so you merely need to look at the board and place the starting units pictured in the specific hexes. Our next step is that we're going to place the reinforcement boards. There is a reinforcement board for each point on the compass, north, south, east, and west. The Allies player has boards in the north, the west, and the south. The Axis player's reinforcement board is placed in the east. So the next step in the setup phase is that we're going to put the units on each of the reinforcement boards. A quick note, if you see a gray or red line beneath a unit, it means that there is a gray or red chip there. Chips are used to conserve space. A gray chip equals 1 unit and a red chip equals 5 units. The figure on top counts as 1 unit and the chips beneath are used to keep track of the other units without placing them on the board. So here are the units for the Allies' southern reinforcements. These are the units for the Allies' northern reinforcements. Here are the units for the Allies' western reinforcements, which also includes Commonwealth units. And finally, the Axis player will place his units on the eastern reinforcement board for Axis reinforcements. And now the reinforcement boards are set up and ready for play. Next, we're going to set up the off-board area for each side. I'm going to recommend setting up your off-board area into 3 distinct areas. The first is your supply depot. The second is a motor pool for trucks. And the third is an airfield for your fighters and bombers. Every turn, the Allies receive 11 supply tokens. At the beginning of the game, all trucks are on the board. However, later in the turn, all the trucks will be brought off-board to this motor pool so you can organize the supplies that will be brought back to the field. The Allies' Air Force for the area is composed of 9 fighters and 3 bombers. The Axis player would set up their off-board area in a similar fashion, with a supply depot, a motor pool, and an airfield. The Axis player receives 9 supply tokens per turn. The Axis Air Force is much smaller, composed of 3 fighters and 1 bomber. And with that, the game is finally set up and we're ready to start learning how to play. Now it's time to learn how gameplay works. As I said earlier, the game is composed of 8 turns. Each turn is composed of 4 phases. The first phase is air combat. However, due to inclement weather, air combat only occurs from the 5th turn until the 8th turn. Therefore, for the first 4 rounds, we skip this phase. The second phase is ground combat. The game begins with this phase, but only for the Axis player in turn 1. This is due to the German surprise attack that starts the Battle of the Bulge. During the second turn and on, both sides are equally engaged in the battle. The third phase is movement and reinforcement, and the fourth phase is board upkeep. So next, we're going to step through each of these phases, starting with the Axis surprise attack at the beginning of the game in Phase 2, ground combat. So here we go, Phase 2, ground combat, the Axis surprise attack. At the beginning of the ground combat sequence, players typically roll for initiative. The Axis player and the Allies player will each roll one 12-sided dice, and the one with the highest score will go first. However, turn 1 is the German surprise attack. In turn 1, there is no roll for initiative. In fact, turn 1 is solely devoted to the Axis surprise attack. Now, before we get overwhelmed by everything on the game board, let's go through a simple example of ground combat and how the mechanics work. In the first step, you're going to choose the attacking hex. The hex must be adjacent to an enemy unit, and each hex is only eligible to attack once per turn. So in this example, we're going to select the center hex with the 2 tanks. Next, you need to select your target hexes. There are 3 eligible target hexes that we could use for our attack. You can choose as many target hexes as you can support with the number of units and the number of supply tokens. Each target hex costs 1 supply token to attack, and requires at least 1 unit to conduct the attack. To pay for the attack, you can use the supply tokens inside your attacking hex or any supply tokens that are adjacent to your attacking hex. When you've decided on a target hex, you will move the supply token to the border between the 2 hexes and flip it over so the arrow shows. So let's say we're going to attack the target hex to the west with our 2 tanks. This is a basic attack utilizing all the units inside the attacking hex. However, you can also plan attacks that are much more complicated. So for example, if you have 2 tanks in your attacking hex, you can divide those forces by using 2 supply tokens to select 2 target hexes. So let's back this up just a little bit. We're going to use the supply token inside the attacking hex and the upper tank to attack the hex to the northwest. We will use the supply token in the adjacent hex and the lower tank to attack the hex to the southwest. So you can see you can be creative and come up with a number of different attacks as long as you have the supply tokens and the units available. So for our first combat example, let's say this is the beginning of the game and the Axis player has the surprise attack. The Axis player can choose any of the adjacent hexes along the front line to attack. I'm going to select these German units in the hex containing the city of Dogfight. When attacking from this hex, my decisions for a target hex are very limited due to the river. There is no way for my tanks and artillery to cross the river to the northwest and the southwest. Therefore, I need to follow the road that has a bridge across the river that will lead me into the hex containing the city of Clairvaux. I'm going to pay for this attack with a supply token from an adjacent hex. So now we're going to slide the whole board up so we can access the combat strips and conduct a battle. Next, we're going to pull out the combat strips for each of the Allies' defending units. The Allies have 1 infantryman, so we pull out the combat strip to 1. There is an Allies' artillery piece, so we pull out the artillery combat strip to 1. And they're defending 5 supply tokens. So we're going to pull out the supplies combat strip. The trucks and the supply combat strips only have 1 symbol, but they can be hit multiple times. Next, we're going to count our number of defending units. The infantry is 1, the artillery piece is 2, and although there are 5 supplies, they only count as 1 on the combat strip. So the supplies are 3. Now, since we have 6 or less units, we're going to keep counting until we get to 6 by starting over. The infantry is also 4, the artillery piece is also 5, and the supplies are also 6. Now that the defense is ready and the targets are all lined up, we're going to set up the attack. So if you look at the table to the left, you'll see that each unit has an associated attack dice number. These are the number of dice you get to roll during an attack. Infantry can roll 1 attack dice. Tanks can roll 2 attack dice. Artillery can roll 3 attack dice. Trucks and supplies cannot roll attack dice, but they can be targets. Later in the game, the weather will clear and planes will become available. A fighter attacks with 1 attack dice, and a bomber attacking ground units can attack with 4 attack dice. So looking at our German offensive units, we have 4 tanks that get 2 attack dice each for a total of 8 attack dice. We have 1 German infantryman that gets 1 attack dice, and 1 artillery piece that gets 3 attack dice. So for our attack against the Allied units, we get 12 attack dice. So here we go, we're going to commence the attack and roll the dice. A roll of 1 through 6 is a hit. A roll of 7 through 12 is a miss. So we roll our dice. We get 7 hits and 5 misses. Now we need to map our hits to the combat strips to see the damage that's inflicted. We rolled 2 1s, so we move those dice to position 1. When you look at the chart on the left, you can see that each unit reacts differently to the number of hits it receives. If the Allies' infantry unit had received 1 hit, it would have retreated, but it received 2 hits, so it is eliminated. The next 2 hits land on the artillery piece, and 2 hits means the unit is destroyed. The next hit roll is a 4, and that lands on the infantry unit again. Since the infantry unit is already dead, this is just overkill, so the shot is kind of wasted. Now we're going to learn a valuable lesson about the dangers of overkill. The next 2 shots are 6s and they land on the supplies. Since we got too wild with our gunfire, we ended up blowing up 2 supply units. Supplies are a very critical component of the Germans' advance. In certain situations, you need to be careful with overwhelming force because your extra shots could end up just destroying all the valuable supplies. Trucks are another non-combative unit that can be taken out by stray fire. Later on, I'll show you how these units can be commandeered and become your own. So while the Germans won this battle, they will only be able to commandeer 3 out of the 5 supplies. Usually, after the battle is resolved, the initiative is passed to the other player. That player chooses one of their own attacking hexes and another battle takes place. Each player takes turns in this fashion until both decide they do not want to attack anymore, or they've exhausted all the hexes they can attack from. However, in the first turn, the Allies are taken completely by surprise. The Germans can attack repeatedly without reprisal. Our last example worked great for small battles, but what about larger conflicts with more than 6 units in the defense? There's an extra step to the battle process. So let's walk through a scenario for a large battle. In this example, the Allied player decides to attack the hex to the east of Martelang. The hex east of Martelang contains 9 Axis units, 3 infantry, 3 tanks, 2 artillery, and 1 truck. So now we're going to pull out the combat strips for the defending units. The Germans have 3 infantry defending the hex, so we're going to pull out the combat strip for infantry to 3 units. There are 3 defending tanks, so we pull out the combat strip for tanks to 3 units. There are 2 defending artillery batteries, so we're going to pull out the artillery to 2 units. And finally, there is a truck in the hex, so we're going to pull out the truck combat strip. The Allied player is attacking with 2 infantry and 4 tanks. So if we look to the chart to the left, you'll see that for each infantry unit, you get 1 attack dice. For each armor unit, you get 2 attack dice. So when the Allies total up all their attack dice for their units, they have 10 attack dice. So for step 1, the Allies are going to roll their 10 attack dice. A dice roll of 1 to 6 is considered a hit, and a dice roll of 7 to 12 is considered a miss. So the Allies player rolls the dice and gets a 1, a 2, a 4, another 4, a 5, a 6, another 6, a 7, a 10, and an 11. So out of the 10 dice we rolled, we got 3 misses, so we're going to remove those. Now we're going to re-roll the dice to assign the hits. Each dice number is going to correspond to the units on the combat strips. For example, if you roll a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, a 6, a 7, an 8, a 9, and when you reach the end of your units, you start over again from the beginning. A 10, an 11, and finally a 12. First, we're going to re-roll our 7 hit dice. So now we match our hit rolls with the numbered units on the battle strips. So we place our 3 roll on the 3 unit, our 6 roll on the 6th unit, which is a tank, our second 6 roll on the same tank unit, our 7 roll goes on the 7th unit, which is an artillery piece, our 9 roll goes on the 9 unit, which is a truck, the roll of 11 is matched to the 2nd infantry unit. And our roll of 12 lands on the 3rd infantry unit. Now, when you look to the chart to the left, you can see that each unit is dealt damage differently based on 1 hit versus 2 hits. Okay, so now let's resolve the hits in sequential order. The 1st infantry unit that was eligible for a roll of 1 or 10 received no hits. The 2nd infantry unit that was eligible for a 2 or an 11 did receive 1 hit. So if you look at the chart for infantry, you can see that 1 hit equals a retreat. The 3rd infantry unit, which was eligible for a roll of 3 or 12, received a hit on both. According to the chart, when an infantry unit receives 2 hits, it's eliminated. The 1st tank on the battle strip was eligible for a roll of 4, but there was no rolls of 4. The 2nd tank was eligible for a roll of 5, and same story, there was no 5s. However, the 3rd tank was eligible for a roll of 6, and we had 2 6s, so that tank is destroyed. The 1st artillery unit was eligible for a roll of 7, and there was a 7, so that unit will retreat. The 2nd artillery unit had no rolls of 8. The truck unit was eligible for a roll of 9, and there was a 9, so looking at the chart you can see that that truck was destroyed. In the last battle example, we had units that retreated, so let's look at how retreats work. Retreating units have 2 outcomes. The first is if there is at least 1 withdrawal option to an adjacent hex. If an adjacent hex is either friendly or empty, then the units retreat successfully. However, if there are no withdrawal options, for example, the hex is surrounded by enemy forces, then the retreating units are eliminated. And that is how retreats are handled in Axis and Allies Battle of the Bulge. Now that we've finished the ground attack phase, it's time to move on to Phase 3, Movement and Reinforcement. During this phase, the key concept to learn is zones of control. Zones of control can be created by infantry, armor, and artillery. Any of these units in a hex exudes a zone of control. This zone of control expands to cover all adjacent hexes. When an enemy unit enters a zone of control, they must immediately stop. The opposite is also true. If a unit leaves an enemy zone of control, they must also stop. Now that we understand the basic concept of a zone of control, we can move on. At the beginning of Phase 3, the first action that both sides will take is to remove any trucks not in a zone of control back to their off-board area. Basically, if you have a truck that is adjacent to an enemy unit that can exhibit a zone of control, that truck cannot be removed back to the off-board area. Once each player has removed their trucks that are not in a zone of control, then they move to the next action. In every turn's movement and reinforcement phase, the following sequence happens. First, the Axis player will move their ground units and reinforce units, and then the Allies will move their ground units and then reinforce units. Similar to the concepts we learned in ground combat, you pay a supply token to activate all infantry, tanks, and artillery in a hex for movement. Trucks do not require supply tokens to move. The same rules also apply for using supply tokens. You can use a supply token in the hex with the units you want to activate, or you can use supply tokens adjacent to the units you want to activate. When you pay the supply token, flip it over to the arrow side in the activated hex as a reminder of which units have been activated and the direction they moved. You may immediately move units you pay for. In the case of infantry and artillery, you can designate them to be picked up by a truck later during the reinforcement part of this phase. Another key point, units can only be activated for movement once per turn. The basic rule is you must stop immediately if entering a zone of control. However, here are some additional hex movement rules. When a unit enters an enemy-controlled city, they must stop. A unit cannot enter a hex that contains enemy infantry, tanks, or artillery. However, if the enemy hex only contains trucks or supply tokens, you can move in. This type of move is called commandeering, and we'll cover off on that a little bit later. If you pay an extra supply token to activate a hex for movement, all tanks starting in that hex may perform a blitz maneuver. A blitz maneuver allows you to make one extra move of one hex after you finish with your normal move, either on-road or off-road. And either in or out of the enemy zone of control. This allows tanks to get behind enemy lines, move easily through the enemy zones of control, and make tactical maneuvers more easily. Now that we've covered off on movement, it's time to talk about reinforcements. Let's take a closer look at the reinforcement boards. The reinforcement board is organized into lanes based on the turn in the game. Each lane shows the available reinforcement as well as some historical context to add some flavor to the game. You'll also notice on particular reinforcement boards that units are not available every single turn. For example, turn 1, turn 2, turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, and turn 6. Turn 7 and 8, nothing. During this phase, you will add reinforcements to the edge of the board that is associated with your reinforcement direction. For example, an Axis tank would appear on the eastern edge of the board. A quick note, you can hold back reinforcements and play them during later turns if you're not ready to bring them on the board yet. You do not have to field every reinforcement on its designated turn. However, you cannot play any reinforcements before the turn in which they're available. Okay, now let's talk about trucks. Okay, remember when we set up our off-board area? When trucks return from the battlefield, you'll place them here in the motor pool. Trucks enter the board at the edges and deliver their cargo to the destination using roads. They may also stop on their route and pick up infantry and artillery as well as supply tokens designated for pickup. Remember, if a truck enters an enemy zone of control, it must stop. Whenever you enter an enemy zone of control, it can be difficult to get out again. You also take a risk that your trucks and supplies may be commandeered by the enemy. One strategy for trucks delivering supply tokens is to stop adjacent to your units and deliver the tokens there. Your units can use supply tokens. They're in a hex adjacent to their position. And you can keep your trucks out of the zone of control, which is usually adjacent to the enemy. Since Axis and Allies' Battle of the Bulge has such a huge emphasis on supply logistics, trucks are naturally critical to this game. Each truck can transport 6 units. These units can include infantry, artillery, and supplies. Trucks can be loaded with any off-board reinforcements available, regardless of which of your reinforcement charts they're coming from. This is because a truck would have time to drive and pick up the reinforcements from various locations. Trucks can also be loaded with off-board supply tokens. If a truck has space open and hasn't yet finished its move, it can pick up in-play infantry and artillery if their hex has been activated for movement and they haven't moved yet. These units are technically designated for pickup. Trucks can also pick up in-play supply tokens. At the end of the movement and reinforcement phase, each truck drops off all of its contents into the hex it stopped its movement on. This is the only time a truck can drop off its contents in a turn. A quick note, supply tokens cannot be used while they're still on the truck. During the beginning of next turn's movement and reinforcement phase, the truck is then returned back to the off-board area. And this is how you manage trucks and your supply lines. And finally, we're to Phase 4, Board Upkeep. The main purpose of Board Upkeep is to update the front line markers. Let's follow up from our previous battle example, where the Germans took the hex containing the city of Clairvaux. To make it simple, let's also say this is the only hex that was taken over during that turn. For the board upkeep phase, we're going to expand the front line markers to encompass this newly conquered hex. Now that we've expanded the front line, we're going to update the victory point track. As you can see from the board, the value of Clairvaux is 1 victory point. Therefore, we will move the victory track marker up to 1. We will also update the turn marker to turn 2. Remember when we said you could move into a hex containing only enemy trucks and supply tokens? If you can hold that position until the front line markers are updated, then you can commandeer them. When you commandeer an enemy truck, trade it out for a truck of your own color. There, now you've officially commandeered the truck. For board upkeep, you'll also need to enforce stacking limits. Each hex has a stacking limit of 12 units. Within these 12 units, there are also additional unit type stacking limits. Per hex, you are limited to 6 infantry, 6 tanks, and 3 artillery. If a player exceeds their hex stacking limits, there are 2 outcomes. If there is at least one adjacent friendly or empty hex, then the player may withdraw their overstacked units to this hex. However, if there are no withdrawal options, then the overstacked units are eliminated. Once you've completed these tasks, the board is cleaned up and ready for the next round of play. Once you get to turn 5, it's time to start Phase 1, Air Combat. Remember during setup we created an airfield in our off-board area. For example, this is the German off-board area and their airfield. The Germans have 3 fighters and 1 bomber. Every turn, during turns 5 through 8, your air units are replenished on the airfield. You will always have the same amount of air units to use in these turns, whether they all successfully returned from the last mission or they were all destroyed. You always begin an air combat phase with the same number of air units. Now let's move on and we'll learn how to use these fighters and bombers. Air combat is similar to ground combat in that the first step is that you need to conduct a combat initiative roll. Just like in ground combat, each side will roll a 12-sided dice and the highest number places their units first. Next, the side that won the initiative gets to place their aircraft on any hex that they choose. The other player then gets to place their aircraft on any hex that they choose. Then in step 3, you'll resolve the combat that ensues. If aircraft inhabit the same hex, then there's a dogfight. Each side will roll 1 dice for each of their aircraft. A roll of 6 or less hits. If the attacking aircraft survive the dogfight, then they can continue on to attacking the hex, but first they must undergo anti-aircraft fire. The defending player gets to roll 1 attack dice per unit type in the hex. To be clear, that's 1 attack dice per unit type, not per the number of units. Therefore, if you have 1 of every unit type, you can attack with a maximum of 5 dice. Once again, hits occur on a 6 or less. If the attacking planes survive the anti-aircraft fire, then they can attack the units on the ground. This is conducted like normal ground combat, except for fighters attack with 1 dice and bombers attack with 4 dice. So let's take a closer look at each of these combat examples. First, let's take a look at an example of a dogfight. Dogfights occur when both sides move aircraft into the same hex. Each side will roll 1 battle dice for each aircraft unit they have in the dogfight. A quick note, bombers only receive 1 battle dice for dogfights. They receive 4 dice later on when they attack ground units. When rolling the dice, a roll of 1 through 6 is considered a hit. A roll of 7 through 12 is considered a miss. Hits are plotted on the aircraft combat strips, just like ground combat. A hit of 1 through 6 corresponds to the unit number on the aircraft combat strip. A quick note and potentially a strange rule. Each pullout level on the combat strip is composed of 2 unit spaces. If you have odd-numbered air units, then there's a potential for a second miss. As you see in our example here, each side has 3 air units. If you roll a 1 through 6, it's a hit. However, if that roll is a 4, that number is going to land on an empty space on the combat strip and becomes a sort of second miss. Just be aware that this is a possibility when playing the game. Next, let's look at an example for anti-aircraft fire. In this example, our German squadron is composed of 3 fighters and 1 bomber. They are attacking a hex with each type of defensive unit. Therefore, each unit type gives the defender 1 battle dice for a total of 5 battle dice. The attacking aircraft are considered defenders in this part of the battle, and they are plotted on the aircraft combat strip. Just like in other forms of combat, a roll of 1 through 6 is a hit, a roll of 7 through 12 is a miss. Once all dice have been rolled and any potential damage calculated on the units, it's time to move to the next phase of combat. So our planes have finally reached the objective and it's time to complete our attack run. Following our previous example, let's say the Allies have 1 of each unit type. And let's say that our squadron suffered no casualties. So let's pull out the combat strips to support that. Since we have less than 6 units defending, let's count out the numbers. Looking at the chart, we can see that we get 1 attack dice for each plane and 4 attack dice for our bomber. So we will roll a total of 7 attack dice. So we rolled and got 5 hits and 2 misses. So let's map the hits and we'll see how the air raid turned out. So we rolled double 2s, so we hit the tank and destroy it. We rolled a 3, which causes the artillery to retreat. We rolled a 4, which destroys the truck. And we rolled a 5, which destroys 1 supply token. After that, our planes will return to base and air combat is complete. So now you have a pretty good idea of how Axis and Allies Battle in the Bulge works. Each turn you will complete this sequence until you've reached the 8th turn and the game is over. If you reach the 8th turn and the Axis are not able to accumulate 24 victory points, then the Allies win. Or you will end the game after a turn when the Axis player has captured enough cities and towns to equal 24 victory points. In this event, the Axis player wins. And that sums up the rules for the second game in the Axis and Allies campaign series, Battle of the Bulge. Each of these campaign series games have different mechanics from the main Axis and Allies series, as well as different mechanics to each other. While they're all fun games to play, Battle of the Bulge stands head and shoulders above the other two games in the series. Managing the supply line statistics of your armies makes for a fascinating game. I also love the fact that you can watch the Bulge grow or get pushed back on the game board. The only bad thing about Axis and Allies Battle of the Bulge is that it is so hard to come by and so expensive when you do. So if you come across a copy that's reasonably priced, snatch it up, you'll be glad that you did. It's a very solid game. And that wraps up this edition of Harsh Rules. I'm Ben Harsh. I thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode.